She stood near gate 21, her hoodie hanging loose over her frame, her jeans faded at the knees, her hands tucked inside the sleeves like she was trying to hide inside herself. The airport was loud, too loud for her thoughts, but her eyes stayed still quiet, scanning the passengers around her, as if looking for a familiar face that never came. A boarding announcement echoed through the speakers, but she did not flinch. She had been here since dawn. She had not eaten since the vending machine swallowed her last dollar the night before, and gave her nothing in return. The woman next to her, in a long red coat, glanced once at her, then looked away, adjusting her designer bag, like it might catch something from her clothes. The girl looked down at her shoes. They were old, but clean. She had washed them in a gas station sink 2 days ago, when she knew she would be walking through terminals where people wore perfume that cost more than her entire backpack. They called boarding for rows 20 to 30, and that was her cue. She picked up her bag, the zipper barely holding on, and stepped forward, her boarding pass already in her hand, and slightly bent from being held too long. The attendant at the gate gave it a glance, then a second longer glance, then waved her through with a nod that lacked interest or warmth. Inside the plane, the air was cool and dry. The overhead lights made everything feel a little too white, too sterile. She moved through the narrow aisle, looking for seat 26B, her shoulder, brushing past a man with a laptop open and eyes narrowed, as if even her presence cost him time. She found the seat. It was next to a window, and already someone was sitting in the aisle seat, a woman, maybe 50, maybe 60, reading a magazine with an article about perfect vacation skin. The girl smiled slightly, said, "Excuse me," and slid into the row as gently as she could. The woman did not look up. She placed her bag under the seat in front of her, her hands slightly trembling, not from fear, but from the kind of tired that wraps around your bones, and does not let go. She took a breath, leaned back, and closed her eyes just for a moment, hoping that maybe she could make it to the next place without anyone asking her questions, without anyone staring at her too long. But then the footsteps came, fast heels, clicking down the aisle, purposeful and sharp, and then a voice too smooth, too cold, saying, "Miss, I need you to come with me for a moment." And the girl opened her eyes and saw the flight attendant standing there with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and everything inside her started to freeze slowly like a lake in winter. She stood up slowly, her knees stiff from sitting too long, and her eyes searching the flight attendant's face for some kind of clue, some kind of softness. But there was none, only a smile too perfect and eyes too sharp, and a voice that said it again, "Please come with me just a moment, nothing to worry about." The passengers in the nearby rows looked up, then looked away like people do when they see something uncomfortable, and they want to pretend they didn't. A man with headphones pulled them down just a little, just enough to hear the girl say, "Is there a problem?" And the attendant said, "Not here, please, just step outside the aircraft, and we can discuss it." Her heart started to race, not because she had done anything wrong, but because the way people were starting to look at her made her feel like she had, and her legs moved, because when someone in uniform tells you to move, you do, even when you don't understand why. The aisle felt longer on the way back. The people felt closer, like their stares had weight, and she was carrying all of them on her shoulders. A little girl in row 9 whispered something to her mom, and the mom just nodded and pulled her child closer, like she was protecting her from something dangerous. When they reached the front of the plane, the flight attendant stopped just outside the open door and turned to her with that same professional smile and said, "We have certain appearance guidelines, and unfortunately your outfit does not align with those today." The girl blinked once, then twice, trying to understand what that meant. She looked down at her hoodie. It was zipped up and plain. Her jeans were full length, not even ripped. Her shoes were scuffed, but clean. She said quietly, "I wore this on my last 2 flights. No one said anything before." The attendant said, "Well, this crew is different, and we have the right to refuse boarding if a passenger's attire is considered inappropriate or distracting." And the girl asked what exactly about her was distracting, But the answer did not come. Instead, there was silence that said more than words ever could. Behind them the jet bridge was quiet, too quiet, like the calm before something cracks, and the girl looked around wondering if someone would say something, if someone would speak up. But all she saw were uniforms and closed doors and cold metal walls. She opened her backpack slowly and pulled out a small folded paper. It was a copy of her mother's death certificate, the only proof she carried that she wasn't just a runaway, that she was traveling with a purpose to a place where grief was waiting with both arms. She held it up and said, "I need to get home, I need to get to her, please." And the attendant's eyes flickered for a second, but then settled back into that same look that said rules were rules and policies were policies, even when hearts were breaking in real time. And just as she looked down at the floor, wondering where she would sleep tonight, she heard footsteps again, slow, heavier this time. And she turned without knowing why and saw a man stepping onto the plane with a look that stopped everything mid-breath. He was not dressed like a typical passenger. His shoes were polished, but not loud. His suit was tailored, but not flashy. His face calm, lined with age and decisions, the kind of face that had seen boardrooms and battlefields and boardings, just like this one, but from a very different angle. He stepped onto the jet bridge and paused as if he already knew something was wrong, as if he could sense the silence that had settled over the doorway like dust and guilt. He looked first at the flight attendant, then at the girl, then at the paper she still held in her shaking hand, and finally at the emotion hovering just behind her eyes. The attendant straightened her back, adjusted her scarf, and greeted him with the kind of practiced warmth that comes from years of flying, but it cracked slightly when she read the badge clipped to his chest, because it did not say passenger, it said something far more complicated. It said Chief Executive Officer, and under that the name of the very airline that now stood between the girl and her grieving family. The man said nothing for a moment, letting the silence do the work. The girl looked at him, unsure if he was just another obstacle, or maybe a witness, maybe even a wall, or maybe something else entirely. She lowered her arm slowly, the paper slipping back into her bag, as if even that proof did not matter anymore. The attendant was the first to speak, her voice softer now, almost careful. She explained that there had been a dress code violation, that it was a sensitive issue, that discretion was being used for the comfort of all passengers. But the man did not nod. He did not agree. He simply asked a question that cut through every excuse like a blade. "What exactly about her is making people uncomfortable?" he asked, and this time his voice was not loud, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that made people stop talking and start thinking. And the attendant began to answer, but he raised a hand and said again, "What exactly is the issue? Because I see a young woman in clean clothes with a valid ticket and a reason to fly." He turned to the girl and asked her name, and she told him softly, and he repeated it like it mattered, like it was more than a label, like it deserved space. And then he asked if she had done anything wrong or made anyone feel unsafe, and she shook her head and said nothing, but her eyes filled with something too heavy to hide. He looked at the attendant one last time and said, "Get her seated, the plane leaves on schedule," and the attendant nodded, but her posture had changed. The control was no longer hers. The moment had shifted, and the girl stood there stunned, because someone had finally spoken for her without her needing to beg for kindness. She walked back down the jet bridge, her steps, unsure, like a dream might vanish with one wrong move, and the CEO walked with her, not beside her, not behind her, but slightly ahead, opening the way like he was clearing the path, not just to a seat, but to something she thought she had lost. Dignity, respect, and a little bit of hope. She stepped back onto the plane, this time with a different weight in her chest. Not fear, not exactly, but something just as strong, a tightness that wrapped around her ribs, and whispered that maybe, just maybe, she had been seen, really seen, by someone who mattered. And that feeling was unfamiliar and overwhelming. The passengers noticed right away not just her return, but the man behind her, the way he walked with intention, Not arrogance, the way his eyes scanned the cabin like every detail mattered, like every seat told a story, and he wanted to hear them all. Some people looked down, avoiding the moment, like it was a private thing, like shame they had ignored too long. A few glanced up, and then back at their phones, pretending they had not watched her walk out, like she was a mistake to be erased from the aisle. But one man in business class leaned slightly into the aisle enough to catch the small tremble in her steps, and the way she gripped her bag tighter, now like it might anchor her to the ground if the plane suddenly opened up and dropped her into nothing. The woman in the red coat from the gate shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She recognized the girl now, her face, her silence, the way she had waited without complaint for the gate to open, and now she looked away, because kindness not given is sometimes louder than cruelty. She reached her row again, 26B. The woman, still in the aisle seat, glanced up briefly, then moved her bag without a word, without a smile, but also without resistance. And that was enough, for now the girl sat down, placed her bag beneath the seat again, but this time her hands were still, they did not shake. The CEO paused in the aisle, made sure she was settled, then gave a small nod to the crew near the cockpit, his voice quiet but firm. Let's prepare for departure. His words simple but heavy, they carried something with them, a message that this flight would not continue, as if nothing had happened. The flight attendant who had stopped her earlier now stood at the front of the plane, her face composed, but her eyes restless, like a storm had passed, but left her drenched. The CEO said nothing more to her, only walked past, like some truths did not need to be repeated out loud. As the engines began to hum, and the cabin filled with the subtle vibrations of takeoff, the girl leaned back in her seat, closed her eyes, and breathed deeper than she had in days, her mind drifting not just to where she was going, but to how far she had come. Outside the window, the runway lights blurred past like memories and mistakes and moments that almost broke her, but didn't quite. She thought of her mother, of what she would say if she could see her now, and somewhere in that silence she found a kind of peace. Not victory, not yet, but something closer to survival, and maybe even the beginning of something better. The plane settled into the air, and the hum of the engines became a steady background to the quiet thoughts swirling inside her mind. She looked out the window again, watching the ground shrink beneath them, her eyes lost in the dark stretch of sky and lights below. The woman in the red coat had returned to her magazine. The man with the laptop had closed it and resumed his own journey with his own thoughts, and the flight attendant, who had caused so much trouble, was now quietly serving drinks at the front of the cabin, like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just tried to take a part of this girl's soul with her uniform. But the girl felt it, the shift, the way the atmosphere had changed when the CEO walked away, the unspoken apology that wasn't said, but lingered like a presence in the aisle that no one dared to mention. It was too awkward, too personal, but the weight of it was there. She shifted in her seat, her eyes flickering to the seatbelt sign above her that remained illuminated, and the passengers seemed so still, so calm, as if they had not noticed the small storm that had passed over the cabin only moments ago. But she noticed everything now more sharply than ever. And then she felt it again, the gaze of someone watching her from the row behind, just a flicker at first, but unmistakable. And as she turned her head slightly to the left, she caught a glimpse of his face. It was the man from the gate, the one who had watched her closely when she had walked out earlier. His face had softened now, almost sadder, but there was something in his eyes that made her heart race. It wasn't pity, it wasn't judgment, it was understanding, something so rare and fragile in a world that often ignores the quiet struggles of people who go unnoticed. He wasn't looking at her to see her failure, he wasn't waiting for her to break, he was watching her, because he understood what it meant to be invisible in a crowd, what it felt like to be judged before you even had a chance to speak. She turned away quickly, unsure why she felt exposed now, unsure why this man who didn't know her had the power to make her feel so seen, so raw. She folded her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead at the back of the seat in front of her, willing the heat that had risen in her cheeks to fade away. But the feeling didn't fade. The weight of being watched lingered, and she could feel his eyes again. Even when she didn't look, she wanted to tell them to stop, to look away. But she didn't know how to say that without sounding rude, without sounding like she couldn't bear being seen. And so she said nothing. Her mind began to race again with the what-ifs. What if the CEO hadn't stepped in? What if the attendant had refused to let her back? On what if she had been left behind, standing alone on the tarmac in front of a crowd of strangers who would never have known why she was there? The thought twisted inside her, like a knot tightening deeper, but it was a thought she would not allow herself to hold on to for too long, because tonight she had a seat, she had a place in this world, even if it was only for the few hours that this flight would last. And that was enough for now. The plane was high now, the world below nothing more than tiny lights scattered across the darkness, and the seatbelt sign had been turned off. The air was cooler now, the hum of the engines less intrusive, but the silence still felt thick, like something important had been said, and it had been too quiet to hear. She tried to relax in her seat, but the eyes behind her were there still, the man from earlier, the one who had looked at her with understanding, not pity, but something else, something deeper, something that made her feel like the walls were closing in, and there was no way to escape. He was still staring at her, or maybe she just imagined it, but it felt too real to ignore, too heavy to push aside. She shifted uncomfortably, then glanced back over her shoulder, trying to catch his gaze, just to see if he would look away. But he didn't. He was still watching her, his face unreadable, like he was waiting for her to say something. Her mind raced and her heart beat faster, but she didn't know what to do with the feeling of being seen so completely, the kind of feeling that made her want to shrink into herself or stand taller, but she wasn't sure which one would be right. She turned back toward the window, her breath coming a little faster than it should, but she couldn't stop it. She couldn't stop the flood of thoughts coming at her one after another, the questions that had been floating around her head for so long, but now they seemed louder, now they seemed urgent. What if she hadn't gotten on the plane? What if she had been forced to leave? What if her story had been over before it even started? The sound of the flight attendant's voice broke through her thoughts as she made her way down the aisle, her cart rolling behind her. But when she reached the girls' row, she paused just for a moment before offering a drink with a forced smile, like nothing had happened, like the tension didn't fill the air between them, like the girl hadn't just been humiliated moments earlier in front of all these strangers. She didn't want to take anything from her, didn't want to pretend that everything was okay, but her voice came out softer than she intended when she asked for water, and the attendant moved on quickly without saying anything more. The man behind her shifted in his seat, his hand brushing his chin like he was thinking, but the girl couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else going on, something she wasn't supposed to understand, something that felt out of place, but she didn't know how to ask about it, or even if she should. It was then that the CEO appeared again at the front of the cabin, moving down the aisle with his slow, confident steps, his eyes scanning the faces of everyone on board, his gaze never lingering too long, but always enough to make sure everyone felt noticed. And when he reached her row, he stopped just for a moment, looked down at the girl, and nodded as if telling her he was still there, still watching out for her. And in that moment, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Before, she wasn't alone, not really, not anymore. The CEO stood at the front of the plane, and his presence was like an anchor, the kind of weight that made everyone stop what they were doing just to take a breath. And when his eyes met hers again, she felt it deep in her chest, that sense of recognition, not from him, but from herself. It was as if he had given her something she hadn't realized. She needed permission to exist in this space without apology, permission to take up room without shrinking back. And for the first time since she had boarded this flight, she didn't feel invisible. Her heart slowed a little, not completely, but enough to make the world seem a little less sharp, a little less cruel. She glanced to her right, The woman in the red coat had finally returned to her magazine. The man with the laptop had opened it again, but his eyes flickered toward her briefly, like something had changed in the air around them. She hadn't seen it at first, but now it was obvious, the way they avoided her, the way they pretended not to see, the way the flight attendants walked by without even a glance. But it didn't matter, not anymore, not now that the CEO had made his mark in the cabin. And she knew she wasn't alone in this moment, even if everyone else pretended she was. The plane continued to hum beneath her feet. The noise was familiar now, not a threat, just the rhythm of the world moving around her. But something had shifted, something that she couldn't put her finger on, but could feel in her bones. And then the man from behind her moved. He stood up, and his seatbelt clicked as he unfastened it, and she tensed just slightly as if he was about to approach her again. But he didn't. He moved toward the flight attendants. Instead, his steps slow, measured, as if he had something to say, but hadn't quite decided how to say it. She turned her head slightly, just enough to watch him as he walked down the aisle and stopped at the front of the plane, his voice quiet but firm. And though she couldn't hear the words, she saw the attendant nod with a tight smile before she walked away. The man returned to his seat, but this time he didn't sit. He just stood there, staring out the window with his back to her, his shoulders stiff, like he was trying to make himself small, trying to hide something in the way he held his posture. And then a voice crackled over the speaker. It was the captain's voice announcing the descent into their destination. But the words didn't matter, not as much as the silence that followed after the announcement, the quiet that hung heavy in the cabin, like everyone was waiting for something they couldn't name. Her hands gripped the armrests, now her fingers digging into the warm fabric, like it was the only thing keeping her grounded, the only thing keeping her from floating away with all the uncertainty that had followed her onto this flight. But then the man who had been standing finally sat back down. His eyes flickered to hers, just once, and for a moment it felt like the whole cabin held its breath, like the weight of everything had shifted again. And it wasn't just about a girl in a hoodie and a flight attendant's rules anymore. It was something bigger, something about dignity, respect, and the spaces we occupy in this world. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe things were going to be okay. The plane began its descent, and the lights of the city below blinked like 1,000 stars scattered across the earth. Everything now felt quieter. Even the air was different. It carried a weight, but not the heavy kind that drags you down, but a weight that felt like peace had settled into the space between her shoulders. She glanced over her shoulder again at the man who had stood before, but now he was back in his seat, staring out the window, his fingers gently tapping the armrest. But his eyes held something different. They were softer now, not filled with judgment or curiosity, but something close to understanding, like he had seen her for who she really was, not just the girl in the hoodie. And just as she settled back into her seat, she heard the soft rustle of paper beside her. She looked up quickly and saw the woman in the red coat had moved closer to her, not far, but close enough to offer something. A small note folded neatly in her hands. She held it out for the girl to take, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The girl hesitated, her heart racing again, unsure of what to expect, unsure of why this woman who had once ignored her was now offering something so personal. She took the note carefully, unfolding it with fingers that shook just a little, and the words on the paper were simple, but they hit harder than anything anyone had said to her today. The note read, "I'm sorry for earlier. We all have moments we wish we could take back." Her chest tightened for a moment, and then it loosened like a breath. She hadn't known she was holding had finally escaped the tension she had carried all flight long, seemed to melt away. And as she looked up to meet the woman's eyes, she saw something there, an apology that wasn't just words, but an understanding that had been earned, not given. The woman smiled softly, then turned back to her seat, and the girl sat back in hers, feeling something new, a strange warmth spreading in her chest, like she had just been given a part of herself, back, something she had almost forgotten was possible. The CEO appeared once more in the aisle as the plane neared the gate, his presence no longer commanding, no longer necessary, but it was still felt in the way he moved with quiet dignity through the cabin, his eyes scanning the faces of every passenger, like he knew something they didn't. But he didn't stop to talk to anyone, just nodded to the crew and walked on. The descent continued smooth and steady, and the girl felt herself relax just a little more with each passing second, that tension from the flight slowly slipping away like the wheels of the plane finally hitting the runway. She could feel the ground beneath her again. She could feel the world turning in the right direction. When the plane came to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign blinked off, she stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment now, like everything that had happened had been building toward this one simple act of walking off the plane. She grabbed her bag, her heart still racing, but for a different reason now. It wasn't fear or doubt anymore. It was something lighter, something that felt like hope. And as she stepped into the aisle, she looked up and saw the CEO one last time. This time, he didn't need to say anything. His nod was enough. And as she walked off the plane into the world waiting for her outside, she realized she hadn't just survived this flight. She had learned something deeper, something that would stay with her long after the plane doors closed.